Hello and welcome. This is XR for Europe's first deep dive discussion of 2025. It's been a little while, but we have many more topics to discuss this year. Today, we are joined by Chris Burgess. We will be talking about how startups and professionals and creatives and entrepreneurs can stop building XR projects if they want to stop in order to start building XR products, which is a very important topic, not just for the individual experience and ambitions and strategies of an entrepreneur or a product project lead, but also at the European level. We often talk about when we're engaging in pan-European discussions about what the continent needs. Uh, we need more entrepreneurs. We need more startups that can scale. And it's scale. It's always about scale in XR. How can these things scale? And I think it's indicative of a way of thinking, which is a transition from project thinking, which is thinking in the scope and the terms of a project and the specialties, the customizations that are required by a project, versus thinking about a product, which is meant to be something that can be standardized, that can be applied in new and novel cases with a wider range of people, inherently something that can scale. So I'm very excited for this conversation. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, this is great. I think it's a good intro to what I'm talking about. And yeah, maybe from here we can go to the slides. I would like to suggest people can kind of interrupt and ask questions if you'd like to, and we can have this to be conversational. I do have a number of slides, but I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So please,
go ahead and load these up. Yeah. So yeah, definitely feel free to post into the comments any questions you have, and we'll try to work through them.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, as Michael has said, the topic here is stop building XR projects and start building XR products. So I wanted to firstly start with a little bit of an overview of my own experience. So, I have been 14 years in XR, and I mean XR in the broadest sense of the word. I started in 2011 for a UK startup called Aurasma, which was a AR for the smartphone. Back then, it was all about working on the iPhone 4 to age myself on in that regard. But I've been in the space ever since then. This is the space that I'm kind of most passionate about. I ran a client services team there. So we built experiences for clients, as I'm sure a lot of the companies joining today will be doing as well. So we worked with Adidas, with Zurich Insurance, we worked with Tottenham Hotspur. We worked with a number of brands across lots of different verticals. We were acquired then in 2017. Actually, we were acquired before, around 2013. We were acquired by HP, but in 2017 they sort of stopped Aurasma as a company, and instead we were folded into HP, and the technology was brought into some HP products. So I can share an example in a minute, but that was about bringing AR to printing, specifically being one of HP's core businesses, and that's when I moved into product. So I moved from services into product, which was an interesting transition. AR in HP ended up kind of not getting the traction that they wanted, and in the end, they closed that down, and I moved to Ultraleap in 2020. Ultraleap was a kind of blend of Ultra Haptics, which was coming out of a research project at Bristol University. It's the idea that you can feel the sense of touch in midair. So it has tiny little speakers that emit ultrasound. And then they sort of merged with Leap Motion. People may be familiar with Leap Motion, which was a hand tracking company that was all about being able to track the full hand. And there I built sort of software, including tools that we built for Unity and Unreal to help people build their own hand tracking experiences. And then we also built applications. So we've got an application on the Steam store and also the Pico store. Then end of last year, I set up. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. With just going back to Leap Motion, because I think that's a touch point that a lot of people will have engaged with. Was Leap Motion the one that had the cat that you could like separate? Was that something that you worked on?
It was, yeah. So that was all about being able to dissect a cat.
Yeah,
But it was like a cartoon style cat. Some people thought
yeah,
that was very weird. Others really liked it.
yeah. I mean, it
Yes.
was definitely eye-catching, and I think was a reference for. I've seen others kind of mimic that same type of demo in other similar projects later. So certainly iconic for those of us around at that time.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, I think definitely people who've been in the space for a long time will have been aware of Leap Motion. May well be aware of Ultraleap, but definitely Leap Motion has a lot more, I guess, brand recognition in that sense. But yeah, in 2024, I sort of set up my own, went out on my own in order to try and help kind of companies building products to grow those products, build better products. And so that's where I'm now focused and why I'm kind of talking you through kind of what we're doing today. Basically, what I wanted to show next was just a couple of videos just to show you exactly what we were working on. So this was at Aurasma, which probably looks like very old tech now. This was an iPad 2. I found it on YouTube. It's from 13 years ago, just to age it. But we worked with Disney and Marvel not long after the acquisition that Disney made, and they sent us the film assets. This was actually the film assets that would be optimized to run on an iPad 2, which was pretty cool. You could also like take your picture with this model. So yeah, that was that. And then when we moved to HP, we started bringing AR into an app for something called a Sprocket. So I have a Sprocket here, which was a small printer which prints pictures about this large. So here you could actually see it was ahead of its time, but you could see the print queue visualized in 3D when you scan the top of the printer. You could also see little avatars for other people connected to the printer. And this is just a really cool one when we started moving into more user-driven experiences, which is at the core of what products are. And then when I moved to Ultraleap, this was moving more into VR and MR. So Ultraleap is integrated into the Varjo headset, which is quite a high price point, but is a great quality headset. And so, as you can see here, Michael alluded to the cat experience, but you can see that within this application. But the vision of the company was to try and transform the way that we interact with XR experiences. So at the time, controllers were the predominant form of interaction, and now we're more familiar with hands. So that's very much what that company was about. But I wanted to just give you an overview of what it is that my background is and what I've been doing. So today I've kind of split this into 3 parts. So I wanted to start by outlining what I see the differences being between projects and products. I then got high level, how do we change the mindset? And then the last bit is how to shift the process. So that's kind of how I've broken it down today. So yeah, again, please let me know if you have any questions as I go through. And Michael, feel free to interrupt. So if we start with products, not instead of projects. So the way I've broken this down is a little table here. I've got scope, deadline, and cost. I thought this was kind of an interesting way of comparing the two. So in projects, the scope, it tends to be client or research driven. So companies that are building projects tend to be services organizations, or they'll be research organizations maybe coming out of a university. So the scope of what they're building in a services agency is going to be around what the client wants. Ultimately, you can help steer the client in a direction that you want, but the scope will be determined by them. And in research, it will be based on the research paper that's been written. That's the technology that you're going to build. In my time at Aurasma building client projects, whilst we tried to steer those clients towards certain types of experiences, ultimately they determined what those were. And the other thing then is what we're building for them is based on their deadline and their budget. The scope tends to be something that we agree ahead of time, and if you want to change that, that is something you charge extra money for. So that's how I see the scope of projects and how I've described it here. In terms of the deadline, again, it's going to be client or grant influenced in a project. So your client determines when they want the deadline to be. You work to that in that instance, and then the cost is going to be, again, dependent on the client or the funding that you're getting if it comes to research. Whereas on the product side, the scope is going to be user needs driven. If you're building something, certainly in XR, you're going to be wanting to solve a problem, or you're going to be enhancing an existing experience. So I think AR on a smartphone has found a use case that works for solving a problem. And the one I'm thinking of is being able to position furniture in your room. Now, being able to visualize what a desk or a chair is going to look like is difficult without it. So I think that's been a really interesting one. The scope of where that goes will be driven by user behavior. If you're not building something that is responding to those user needs, then ultimately your product will not succeed. You can't build it based on your own requirements. Yeah, underneath you might do, but that's ultimately what would drive the scope. Deadline, I've written here as market dependent. Here, there's a number of factors that come into that, but for Ultraleap, we looked very much at the calendar with regards to, when Meta Connect was, when these sort of big events are going to be. So we would tie ours in with AWE to make sure that we were able to ride the wave of when the industry is looking. So that was, when I say market dependent, it's not going to be based on a specific client. It will be based on when is the right moment for your company to do that. And then finally, the cost will be roadmap driven. I'm going to come on to this in a second, but what you'll need is a vision for where you're headed, and then a roadmap is effectively those steps in which you'll take to reach that vision. And what you'll end up doing is looking for funding based on those things that you're going to do to reach that vision, and that's where that will come from. And so I kind of put that out there because I think it's really important to point out, yes, your funding might come from investors, but ultimately those investors will be investing based on your vision and your roadmap.
Yeah, if I could say that, just looking at the way these two categories are separated, I see one as embracing uncertainty and adaptation, and one, as much as possible, trying to predetermine what's going to happen over a certain period of time. The latter being projects, and the more uncertainty accepting approach is more of the product, right? Because user needs, you may hypothesize them, but you have to validate them, and you have to ideally keep discovering and uncovering new user needs in order to keep engaging them. And market dependent, as you said, like with the example of events. But if you can't make that event, you position to something else in the future, right? You're trying to match that up. So is that broadly how you would also see it? Projects being more about predetermination, and products being more about adaptation and real-time adaptation?
Yeah, I'd say you're right there. I don't want to make it about waterfall versus agile, but ultimately that is what it's about. Projects is about, exactly as you've said, you determine exactly what you're building, you assign the budget, and you get the deadline, and that's it. If you want to change that will impact the cost and the deadline. With products, you're trying to, it's a mindset. You've got to realize that you need to be more adaptive. You need to your point, accept risk. And I think it's quite a big change for companies to go through. I think a lot of companies can introduce agile processes, but actually if they haven't got an agile mindset, that doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah.
They can still be quite risk averse. So yeah, it's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, now you see you set up some interesting expectations and tension here, because yeah, I do think it's an ideology that a person has. So you can change the process, but if you don't change the ideology, I'm curious to know what might be the consequences. So you got me hooked.
Nice. So yeah, just to summarize this section, really, then projects are seen as being client or research driven, whereas products will be user needs driven. That's kind of the way to sort of high level think about what it is that I'm talking through today. So yeah, so changing the mindset. I've split this into sort of three areas. I think the first one here is knowing your audience. This is really important because when we're building projects, for example, when I was at Erasmus, we didn't think about end users. What that meant was we were just talking to the people with the money, and in this instance, I'm talking about the decision makers, whether that's your client. So first, you got to know who your end users are, how they're going to use this thing, what do they need it to do. You really need to get into the mind of the people that are going to use your product. Now, at Ultraleap, we were really good at this. We had end users come into the office quite regularly, and we had quite an interesting setup. So we would have them with the headset. We would have a video camera filming them in the headset. We'd have what they're seeing streamed to a PC, and then we also had a GoPro on top, so you could actually see what they're doing with their hands, because it was all about hand interaction. And I think this gave us a load of insights into how end users were using the experience, but they're only part of the equation, right? So in the next one, you're going to need to think about is the decision makers. The people who are buying your product are not going to be the same people as those that are using it in the majority of cases, certainly in a B2B context. And so what if you don't have the right sort of information for these decision makers, then ultimately you won't ever even get to the end users. So it's another sort of audience that you need to think about. And in the Ultraleap days, we were really good at focusing on the end users, but then not so much on the decision makers. So we didn't have a lot of quality data to be able to get a decision maker to think, yes, this is something that I really need. So I think those are arguably two of the biggest groups. With decision makers, if you're selling to consumers, obviously that decision maker can be a parent. So there's other things that you need to think about there. But I think making sure that you understand those and breaking those down in your mind and differentiating between the two is really important. The last one here I've put is implementers. So by this, I mean, at Ultraleap, we were building developer tools. So that was Unity, Unreal tooling. And as a result, we were selling to a decision maker who would be the boss of the person who's going to implement. And then you have the end user who's going to use what the implementer implements. And that was, they care about different things again. So it's, from their perspective, it was, well, how easy is this? How long is it going to take me? What's the process? And so a lot of our user testing took place with implementers to understand how we could ease the friction. How are they using tools today so that we're not asking them to change the way that they do their workflow? And so to summarize here, I think knowing the differences between these, but also knowing how to talk to each of them is really important, because they each need something very different.
Well, it's just I maybe would love to kind of spend some time breaking down this slide and inviting the audience to identify in their context, whether that's education or it's AEC or heritage or cultural heritage and stuff. Who are the end users, decision makers, and implementers in your context? Because obviously in education, you would say, oh, decision makers are the administrators. If in a B2B scenario, they are the administrators who have access to the budget, the implementers are the educators, and the end users are the students. In theory, I mean, that's one potential workflow. But at the same time, then that makes me think, well, which one is the first one cut out, or most frequently cut out, or the most difficult one to satisfy? If you have to satisfy them all, because presumably the decision maker is the first one you have to satisfy in a B2B scenario. And then I would think in education, in my experience, the implementers are the ones that get cut out. They're the ones who seem to be the most devalued, either by the decision makers or the end users. That's the idea that the instructors, educators themselves tend to get cut out. But I wonder in other sectors if it might be different. But anyway, just if not, is that a universal that the implementers are the ones who tend to be the hardest to reach in this process because they're the ones who are least valued by the decision makers and the end users.
It's an interesting one because as in both the Erasmus days and Ultraleap, we needed to make sure that the implementer understood what a good end user experience looked like. And so you're not just focusing on how do I make this easy for the implementer to build, but we need to make it easy for them to build a good experience, a good end user experience. So you end up having to be an expert, help them to be an expert in this new paradigm. When it comes to hand tracking, it's becoming more mainstream now, but at the time it was still so new that common best practices just weren't there. And you could argue they're still being formed, but whilst Ultraleap knew what the end users needed, it was like, how do they unlock that for these implementers? And it ends up being like quite a difficult one to keep focusing on end users whilst continually making it easy for these implementers. So yeah, it's certainly in a new technology, it's a hard one.
And it just reminds me, recently there was a post that got some traction from an educator, an instructor at in Finland, I think through Helsinki XR Center, who was talking about the new Horizon World, design elements. I'm not sure what was new about it because I haven't worked with that platform much, but the idea that this represents a new way to deliver and conduct. It's a new tool for education, for teaching. I think presumably design and maybe interaction design in an immersive space, and compared to using like a game engine. And thinking again that it's a good example that you said, teaching the expert, because in that particular case, I'm sure that instructor is quite expert, but many other instructors who would be teaching about XR or immersive technologies isn't necessarily coming from a design background or an interactive design background. They may be coming from a film and visual design background. And so being able to work within a platform, which is in this case essentially the product, all of that best practice, right? It's already all the controller, the input defaults are set up according to some best practice. Yeah, the hand tracking would already be functional. The networking is already functional. So in many cases, I think that's a good example of what you're saying. You don't presume that the instructor is an expert in all the things they might otherwise need to be an expert in, or the implementer in a training application. You don't expect them to be an interaction designer. You expect them to be maybe a curriculum designer, learning a specialist in learning outcomes. So having to provide all of that for them, I think, but it's a lot of work, because the question is, would they pay for that? Would the decision makers say, yes, we need to pay for a platform that gives excellent XYZ, because we know our implementers don't have that particular skill set or developed expertise?
Yeah, and I think in order to do that, it's a case of the data you collect will be based on an implementer's experience, so that you can share that with a decision maker, right? So if that might be down to efficiency That's a big thing for businesses, right? Like I will adopt hand tracking if it's going to take me 2 hours, but if this is going to take me a few days to implement, I'm probably not going to be interested. So there's, these decision makers are going to need to see like quality outcomes for end users as well as implementers. They kind of need to see all of it. So yeah, I think it's a good point.
Yeah, I think maybe, yeah. Let's see if certainly from our audience, if you have any suggestions to how to engage these different types of audience categories, please let us know, and we'll respond to your suggestions and your input. But otherwise, yeah, let's move on.
Okay, cool. So as I say, first one is knowing your audience. The next one is knowing your market. So I don't think these need to be done in this order, but I think all of these things are really important for shifting this sort of mindset. So understanding market size and growth. By that I mean, and we'll come on to it in the next one, is like once you've got your use case, what market are you playing in? What's the size of it? What's the potential growth of it? How are you? What's the opportunity size there? I think my time at both Ultraleap and Aneurysma, neither of them had picked a specific niche as a use case. So it makes it quite hard to be able to really size a market that you're going after. You can kind of say it's a really large market just because it's very general. And I think that's something to just really be aware of. What's the space you're playing in. Next one I've got is about being aware of the competition. So, well, again, we're going to come on to it in a minute, but I think what are the other kind of players in the space? We Ultraleap tended to double down on the fact that it had a certain type of product, and that therefore the competition wasn't as important. Whereas I think by doing that, you're not quite understanding, how other people might be perceiving things, perceiving a competition. But I think the other thing here is it's not even direct competitors from an XR perspective. There's also what other technologies are you competing with? So at Ultraleap, we developed a way to interact with 2D screens without touching them. And what we were competing with there was a touchscreen. So it's a different technology, but we needed to be aware of that in order to understand how we position ourselves against that. I think that's a really important one to point out here. Last one of these three is identifying trends. So with the hand tracking idea, when Leap Motion first started, it was all about advocating for hand tracking. But by the time give it last year, in the last 2 years, that battle has been won. I think everyone would agree that hand tracking is needed. And so what we needed to do then was to adapt to that. What exactly did people want? They didn't just want hand tracking. They wanted it to be possible to implement it in specific ways. They needed it to be specific sensors that they would work with. There was a lot more to it, and it was up to us to kind of respond to that, make sure that we were always ahead of the trends that are going on in the market. So I think knowing a market is generally a really massive point here.
And that's interesting. How would you maybe distinguish between market trends and from the user feedback, and because your users may or may not represent your market completely, or even at all, really, if you're thinking of growing in your future market. So how would you kind of identify or distinguish between how you track and how you become understand of the market versus just knowing that what your users or how your users are using it, and whether they're using it more and stuff like that?
So, data collection is a kind of hot topic of GDPR and things like that. With Ultraleap, you needed to kind of agree to the terms so that we could actually understand, where the tracking was passing or failing. I think when you're coming to user data, it's a lot more granular. You've really got to understand what it is that you're looking for from the data before you start thinking about what that data is going to be. Whereas I think with the marketing side or the market side, it's a bit more how you're talking to customers. It's a bit more how the industry at large is moving. So maybe that's the way of differentiating it. Really, is the market trends is about the people that you're selling to. I think maybe that's a bit of a broad brush there, because the other thing, say, identifying market trends, we've got the move towards Gen AI now, which is definitely a trend that has sort of left XR not as much of a focus at this point. But obviously, you've still got Meta saying that they're going to be staying in this space, but it's almost like the step there is through Gen AI. So the question then is, well, if that's the trend, how do we bring Gen AI into XR? How do we identify the direction in which technology is being adapted, and how do we sort of make that work with XR? Would that help answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it's an answer to it. One other thing that came from this slide for me is that this looks very much like what you would advise a startup, and so then the question, then not question, but then I think the realization is that a product is a business. A project is not necessarily a business. The business was to get the project, but then the project itself was to satisfy an obligation, but it maybe does not represent business as such. It's a consequence of a priorly conducted business. But with the product, if developing a product is kind of like, well, it's identical to developing a startup, then a product is understood as basically as a startup business. So even a company that maybe has lots of products, each of those products within the context of the company is its own business, and thus has to be doing all these things as a business does. I think that's interesting because you meet lots of people who are brilliant engineers and really driven to make things, but you often do see that a lot of times it's the making of it that's their motivation. That the motivation to make a business is not embedded in that. It's maybe something that they're looking to later. How do I make a business? Why is my business not having the success because I have such a strong product? But I would say that maybe it's important to connect the definition of a product it incorporates that it is a business.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I think ultimately what I'm advocating for here is that a business and a product are at one. But I think to your point, this is important. This is one of the aspects that's important to a startup, right? Knowing your market is just one of the things. And I think it's when combining knowing your audience, knowing your market, and knowing your use case, which is what is required to really shift that mindset towards building a product. So for this, knowing your use case has got starting with defining your problem. I think I mentioned earlier about XR, I think tends to more enhance existing experiences rather than necessarily solve problems. I think, in the traditional sense of a word, products are all about solving problems. Well, it's not always about that, right? It's about how can we enhance an existing experience. So, using AR on a phone, scanning a magazine, you get more information that you wouldn't have got if you'd read the magazine. Suddenly you're enhancing experience. Hand tracking was all about, how can you improve and experience rather than holding something in your hand. You're now being able to interact with it more naturally. You could argue that's solving a problem as well, but it was definitely sort of enhancing a kind of existing experience.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like strengths of problem. This could be, it's like, oh, this isn't as fast as it could be. It's a problem. It's just perhaps not a very compelling or strong problem. It doesn't mean that you can't create value and build a market out of that, but it's not as compelling. And let's think of it like a training, right? Because training is one of those classic use cases that is quite sustainable and quite mature, and well understood with XR. But I often do find that sometimes the motivation for training is not as strong when it's simply to reduce cost, versus we don't have enough trainers. We need to standardize. We need to create a training that overcomes the lack of trainers or the inability to access training environments. That's probably, you could say that over 5 years, it's more likely that a good VR product or solution there is likely to sustain itself because it's solving a rather difficult problem, versus the other where it's kind of subject to budgets and whether this is really, we're doing it to save costs, but how important is saving cost at this particular moment for this particular use case? Could we just stop the training, for example? Could we just find an even cheaper way to do the training, because VR is not the only cheaper way to do the training? So I think that's maybe just an example that it's scale of recognizing the scale of problem, and then also recognizing if it's a low scale, small scale problem, how do you adapt to that to either enhance the perception of the problem or create enough value to provide some security to your product and solution?
Yeah, I like that. I think as of all of these, it's all of these three are supposed to complement one another, right? So defining your problem here is going to be based on user feedback. It's going to be based on understanding the decision maker. It's going to be based on the implementer. You need to validate that problem, not just define it. And then you'll need to refine it as you understand more about your audiences. And to your point, being aware of the competition might be not VR. It's going to be something else. Well, you've got to make sure you've defined the problem to really understand that, really understand the alternative ways of doing it. And all of these things should complement one another in that sense. Number two, I've written, identify uniqueness. This one is, I think, really important in XR at the minute. I've been to a number of trade shows where you've got people or companies that were maybe service agencies that are now building a platform, but what they have been unable to communicate is often what makes them unique versus these other platforms. And I think that's a really important aspect as this industry is beginning to mature. The people that you're trying to sell to are going to start, if they're not already, doing their due diligence where they will be making comparisons to other platforms. There is a more competitive space. So I think it's really important to be able to really identify what makes you unique, and making sure that's really understood by the people that you're selling to in general. Last one is defining interactions. This again is kind of close to my heart, but to use your example of training, if you're using controllers in training and you're talking to, or you're trying to get end users who've never used VR before, if they have to learn how to use a controller, suddenly you increase the length of the training. So that's a problem. You maybe make them feel a bit uncomfortable or unconfident because they're having to learn how to use something new and physically. And also then the training might not be as effective because maybe muscle recall, muscle memory isn't there. So defining not only interactions, but the way in which you interact is really important. So if it's fire safety training, being able to pick up a an extinguisher would be massively helpful. But like thinking about what people are going to be doing inside these experiences is really important in order to determine what are the best interactions for that, and we should be designing kind of around that point. So changing your mindset, hopefully what I've said has been clear, but I think it's not doing just one of these things. I think, in my experience, I've worked Ultrasleep, which did a really good job of knowing the market, maybe not all of its audiences and some about its use case. And I think you kind of need to do all of these things to make sure that your product and ultimately your business will be successful. And I think changing, if you're doing services today, for example, you'll need to start broadening those audiences and understanding who they are. You'll need to think about the market differently. And then I think it's about your use case. If the less use cases you support, the better in the first instance, so that you can kind of grow that out. And I'm going to come on to a company that's done that a bit later on. Yeah, I don't know if you had any question or comments, Michael.
We do have a question from the audience. This is from Enrique. So he says, could you elaborate a bit further on identifying uniqueness? So I think in the previous slide that you had. So if two service agencies are developing a VR learning platform, he says, how can they separate themselves from their competition? So I guess just a little bit of a thought experiment. What would you say there?
I think it's a good question, because ultimately it will come down to a lot of the companies that I would ask this question to. Okay, what makes you unique? Would say, what makes us unique is our use case. Okay, that's part of the story, but there's a lot more that goes into what makes you unique. So again, it's gonna depend on those end users. Maybe you actually target different end users, but the only way you'll understand that is by getting to know their product. And I think identifying uniqueness is about using alternatives. It's about not just reading about it or just talking to someone. I think you really have to understand that and get to the core of it, and from there you can understand how to position yourself versus those alternative products. I think it's probably a bit of a vague answer still, but I think it really depends ultimately on the vision. What's your goal? Who are your customers? What do they need? I think you really got to dig into all of these things combined to sort of get to that.
It's a good go, yeah. But I'd like to take my hand at just thinking out loud about VR platforms for learning that I know of. Not to say that they would have come out of agencies, yeah, certainly. Without naming them, I guess I have to name them. So there's like LearnBright, which is a web VR platform. Then you have like Engage, but then you have platforms that could be used depending on the type of learning. You could have any platform really. You could have Rec Room. You could have had AltSpace before, and actually AltSpace was used for stuff like that too. So what separated them? One of the first things that came to my mind was aesthetics. And I think aesthetics are huge, really huge, for determining which clients are going to consider you more or less credible. And it's frustrating, right? Because aesthetics is not, usually is not functionally that significant. And once someone's really engaging in a VR experience, the aesthetics tends to kind of fade away a little bit. But it is really something that I know for Engage. I know lots of people who've told me it is their preference by far because of the way the avatars are presented. And I would say, for me, the UI, at the very least, the UI, because it had like a tablet that could be in your hand in VR, it had certain things that made it much more credible to audiences coming from a certain background than something like a Rec Room, certainly, VR chat itself. So I would say maybe just my contribution to answering Enrique's question. Aesthetics is one. UI design is one. Appropriateness for what the real world analog of that training or that learning experience would be. Obviously, the content platform is a major difference. If you have your own bespoke content, if you're an agency, versus having collected a catalog of a wider range of content that is accessible on your platform. Those are two things that come in my mind. Plus, also, what type of hardware support? That's a big determinant in the learning case for sure. You want a lot of you want to be able to get in there without a headset. So you want a VR learning platform that doesn't require VR. That's for me always a dissatisfying dissatisfying compromise to make, but it seems to be a real one. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, Enrique, feel free to suggest or come back with some more questions on that topic. It's a good one because there's so many training experiences, so many training experiences, industrial and enterprise training. It is very hard to explain to someone who's more technically inclined or more interactive design inclined what really separates them. But there, of course, there always are separating factors.
Yeah, one I was also thinking about is maybe where data is stored and what's done with data, because that's a massive concern about, is the data being stored in a different geography, for example, or how secure is that data, or what happens with this data? That's definitely something that's massively important as part of that. I think the one about UI is important. I think the other one now, a lot of companies do no code or low code. Well, maybe what makes you unique is the way in which you're doing that, because no code on its own isn't unique anymore. So how are you able to do that? Do you provide examples out of the box that people can use? Maybe that's what makes you unique. I think in a platform way, there's definitely a lot we can do. I think it's just a case of also being aware of what those things are, because if you're not aware, that can also be important for how you evolve. Maybe seeing what someone else is doing will give you the idea to go in a different direction. So there's a lot to learn from that uniqueness.
Yeah, let's see. I think Enrique seemed to be satisfied with that. So thank you again for the question.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Enrique. So part 3 is shifting the process. So I've used this slide as a sort of framework. So I think to move from project thinking to product thinking is about moving from short-term focus to a long-term vision. It's moving from output-driven to outcome-focused. It's moving from having limited user feedback to continuous user feedback, from unclear ownership to dedicated ownership, which I can talk about, and then from an inflexible scope to an adaptive scope. So that's how I'm going to sort of structure this. So these GIFs were supposed to be evocative of short-term versus long-term. On the left, this was what it felt like working at Aurasma at times. The vision, there wasn't a vision for where we were headed. And so what it meant was it was almost like going through a tunnel and going around different corners to work out what it was that we were doing. We were very sort of reactive in that sense. Whereas on the right side here is more, imagining you've got a North Star or a light at the end of the tunnel. This is what you're aiming for. And I think having a vision for, what your use case is, what market you're facing, and what your users are, is really important to them contribute to, well, what's this vision? Where is it that we're headed? But you need to be consistent with that so that it doesn't feel like the company is constantly shifting, because whilst you might need to adapt and shift as you go, I think the most important thing is having that long-term goal and keeping your eye on that. So whilst the path towards that longer-term goal might change, you've always got that in sight. So ultimately, from a hand tracking perspective, the vision was we wanted hand tracking to be to XR what the touchscreen was to the mobile phone. So when we moved from buttons to using a touchscreen, obviously it was massively important and really broadened how phones were thought about. And if the decisions that we make about what we're doing as a product keep getting us closer to that point, I think that keeps everyone aligned. It also just keeps the company sort of consistent in what it's doing. It makes conversations with customers easier. It makes conversations with investors easier. But it's also important that you kind of stick to that long-term vision.
If I can ask just on this, because this is something, when I saw this before, I thought, well, don't you need both, in a team, in a well-structured or, team? Because, right, the short-term focus, that's like getting into testing and adapting features. It's doing into prototyping new elements. I guess from a product development perspective, there's certainly a role for short-term focus, but at a particular role within the product. Versus the long-term one, it's clear. It's more of the business. It's the idea of the sustainability of the product over the course of its long life cycle, is to get to the end, to the natural end of a product life cycle. But I guess just to ask, do you see a role for both? And do you think ideally, in your experience, that's in one person, or it's in different people who have a clearly defined, I have the hat with the long focus, you have the hat with the shorter focus?
It's a good way of putting it. I think short-term focus, maybe it's the word focus that is the one that isn't right there. You're going to need to take short-term steps towards a long-term vision. But focusing short-term maybe isn't the right way of thinking about it. What's quite difficult, and something that we sort of struggled with at Ultraleap a bit, was, hey, we've got this vision. What you're doing today, how does that align with this vision? And if that path wasn't clear, then often I think it was quite difficult to get the teams themselves to understand the relevance of what it was that they're doing. And if I'm too short-term focused without kind of pointing it back to a vision, I think that can kind of create problems for teams in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So next one, I'm going to move from output driven to outcome focused. So by output driven, I mean, for example, at HP, they wanted to deliver a certain number of features, and that was very much output driven. Hey, we delivered 6 features this sprint, rather than thinking about, well, what are the KPIs for these features? Not whether we did the features, but whether they actually had impact. And I think being able to celebrate the fact that you've managed to release 6 features is a good thing, but really, if those features don't have any impact, then your product ultimately isn't going to survive and scale. So I think moving towards measuring what success looks like is really important. I think from a client services perspective, at the Erasmus days, what we would find was that customers would not renew a license with us. So we licensed software for AR because we'd have celebrated the output, but actually no one had identified the KPI for that. And often the customer wasn't in a position to even understand what a KPI should be, because it's such a new technology. How do they measure what success looks like? So how we tried to think about it was, what are you measuring today? And then just think of AR as an extension of what you're measuring today. It's just a different way of capturing those same KPIs. But either way, moving towards this outcome focused output is really important, because the other thing then is it gives you that information that helps with decision makers, for example. So I talked earlier about the fact that decision makers going to want to know ROI for example. Well, if that's not something that you're tracking or thinking about, then you'll end up struggling to be able to communicate to the decision maker to say, hey, this is something that you should be thinking about buying, basically, from a technology perspective. So yeah, outcome focused is massively important as a shift from the traditional sort of services side of things.
Yeah, and just thinking of the people that I've worked with over the years in projects, how often a project manager is not really that engaged or that closely informed in tracking the activities of work packages within the project, and thinking that in a product scenario, that would be a lot more difficult. The person who's in charge of really managing and making important decisions about the product would have to be fairly up to date and at a lower level than it might be traditionally in a project manager, whose job was to ensure that people deliver certain KPIs, because that ultimately is what I need to do at the end to get this project behind us, and unlock any last payments. But just thinking that even the nature of leadership is very, very different, and probably less hierarchical, ideally in a product scenario, just so that decision makers really understand what success is, to be able to define it and communicate that to everyone.
Yeah, it's exactly right. When you've got, this isn't to say that you wouldn't use a project manager in this instance, but like you do need someone that's going to be closer to the product tracking these things, which is exactly where your product owner, product manager comes in. Their job is to really get deep into the product and understand it, not necessarily from being able to code it themselves, but really understanding the user, what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, all of those kinds of things. Yeah, it's a good differentiation. Next one I've got is moving from limited user feedback to continuous user feedback. On this one, when you're building a project, as we did building client projects, we didn't get any user feedback through that process. The feedback was from the client and was from some internal validation, but actually the target end users were never asked for their opinions, so they never sort of shared, and that, I think, ultimately just didn't help those experiences. It didn't help trying to get these software licenses renewed, because we weren't having a good grasp on the way in which things were being used. So I think another aspect which I've advocated a lot for today, but is continuous user feedback. How do we get users in and understand how they're using that? I think there's one aspect is the sort of inviting them in and talking to them. The other is sort of using metrics. There's a third-party software, I think it's called Cognitive 3D. It's a Canadian company that you can integrate into your Unity and Unreal projects, and you can track interactions, you can track all sorts of user behavior, which I think is massively important for instances where you don't get the chance to go out and actively talk to your users constantly. But talking to your users is so massively important because you get the context. You can ask them loads of questions. I think it was really interesting that at HP we did focus groups. So I went over to the US, where we had the target audience being teenagers, which I wasn't aware of what their needs were. And so by talking to them, it was like learning a whole new audience, a whole new way of thinking, and it really evolved how the experiences we built, the way in which we kind of built around the application, the UI, the entire user experience was all based on that feedback. But just doing it once wasn't enough. We had to kind of keep going out to keep adapting what it was that we were building. So I think, if you don't do this, you're going to end up making assumptions which may well cost you time and money because there's something that don't get used. This one is kind of touches on what you were saying earlier, Michael, but rather than maybe a project manager here in this, we've got a Scrum team with a product owner. That is the person in the scenario you've spoken about. They become the one that deeply get involved in the product, understand those KPIs, really look at the overall process. And I think when you start moving to dedicated ownership, I don't mean just from that one person, but I mean a team that owns the product, because they then become experts at that product. They start to get to know their users, they get to know their market. And I think this is really important, because often what happened with building client projects is, at the end of it, well, who owns that project? Who often you don't have continuous development written into a contract. You've just got maybe maintenance written there to make sure that it continues to work. If there's an update, say on mobile, it was like if there was an iOS update, making sure that the experience still worked if there was an update. But beyond that, it was unclear about how that experience would ever evolve. So I think dedicating a team of people to that product that you've built is really important. The other thing then is getting the team that's actually building to also be exposed to the stakeholders. So stakeholders in this instance isn't just internal stakeholders. That could be end users, it could be implementers. But I think it's really important for the development team to be exposed directly to the people who are actually on the outside, so that the teams then sort of gets better at building what they're building. They become more efficient. They start to better empathize. You ultimately create a better way of working. So definitely want to advocate for this.
So just to clarify, is the you here, the one that's floating there, is that meant to represent the user, the decision maker, the implementer? All of them potentially can be the you here. Would they be interacting, you think?
Yeah, I think maybe that's how they've used it in this diagram. The way I was thinking of it was stakeholders would be the user, and you would maybe be the person running the business. But yeah, I think the important thing here is really just more the stakeholder team relationship, making sure that the team definitely hears firsthand feedback rather than hearing it via someone else, because then there can be more misinterpretation. I think there's a lot of value to be had from, actually we would have the engineers that had built the experience be either listening on a video to the end user talking about it, or being in the room to ask the questions. So I definitely advocate for that.
Yeah. Okay. We have another question from the audience.
Yeah.
And we're going a little bit late, but if that's okay for you, I'm happy to go as long as we need. But we have a question from Maria. So she just says, I'll read it out. If you're a small XR company, it can be difficult and expensive to transfer your whole business from a client focused to a product focused. So she says it seems like quite a big risk, and you have to put a lot of resources into research and market analysis and user testing before knowing if there's a change for making a whole new business or product. So let me read that again. So if you have to put a lot of resources into research and market analysis and user testing before you know if there's a chance to create a new business or product, it's difficult to prioritize and to get that done. Is there any advice on how someone might tackle this? I guess manage again that transition with the few resources that they may have.
Yeah, well, I think if you're already building projects for clients, the most important thing is to start by identifying the trends across them. So what do these clients have in common? Because that's the first step to making something that can become scalable. So when you think of, I'm going to talk about an example later, but what the jump that companies like this will make is that they will have started building their own SDK or platform, so that when they're building client projects, they are not reinventing the wheel for every project. They're starting to build something that doesn't mean they do it from scratch every time. It's something repeatable while still being customizable. And I think that's perhaps a good way to start thinking about it. Well, if you can operationalize the way that you're doing things for clients, you will be, as a result of that, learning what clients need throughout that process, and that will start feeding into your platform or your SDK. And then there's a chance then, because you know what your clients have needed, you can then start to think about how you might be able to advocate to those clients, hey, we've got this SDK or platform that is capable of allowing you to do this yourself, so you don't have to pay us to build it for you. Here's a platform. The license fee for using this platform is much less than doing bespoke projects with us, and it allows you then to start scaling that to more customers. So I think maybe that's a good way of starting to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, in what you say, and the question even makes me think. It's thinking about the product that's already that you want as a business, as a small business. What is the product for which you would be the very first client? What could you do, as you said, to streamline, to operationalize, that would make money for you, that would solve a problem that you have? So maybe that's actually an interesting way, not necessarily starting with the need to find external clients that are going to pay for it, but think of what you would pay for with your time and resources. What would create value for you in your work, and then connect that to the clients who are actually paying you for that work. So to seeing if that product for you becomes a product for them, and I mean that just came to my mind as you were answering. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think then the other thing that's really important is that if you're building a product, that you still use that product yourselves, and in that platform sense, that's an easy way to do that, because if you don't use the product you're selling, it's really difficult to empathize with your user. So there was actually they ended up having multiple SDKs that different teams used, rather than using the thing that the customers actually used, which ultimately made it more difficult to support those customers. So I think there's also that to consider as well. Going down that platform route can be an easy way of, so what they say, eating your own dog food. Makes it easier to help those customers when they do have issues.
So we have another question. It's just I have to read it off of the phone. It's not, for some reason, not popping up here for us, but it's from Davide. So he says in their case, they work in games and XR experiences. So he said they find it a bit hard to clearly think in terms of project versus product. In this space, he says, unless you're making a tool or a platform to make other games and experiences, they're not really solving a problem that is repeatable, or can be repeatedly solved by a single product. So because these games and experiences can have very different technical requirements. So he says, he feels like improving the tool set that they use between projects or skills and understand the market better is the best thing that they can do between projects. But I think that kind of highlights what we're talking about, what we were just saying as well, like the idea that what would be the thing that would make your life easier? What would you be the client of a product first internally? And I think that's what you said, the tool sets that you use, as you were saying, operationalize, standardizing, creating it reliable, and then making sure that you work that into the work that you do with externals. I guess from a gaming perspective, it comes to my mind like the editors that companies would have to build the content for their game, making that editor ultimately available to a community for modding purposes. That would be an example of something that was a product created internally to create value, but then ultimately made external facing, and it itself becomes another product. Yeah. How about you,
Yeah,
Cal?
well, at Erasmus, we had a no-code solution which used to be, well, it started as an internal tool. And then it got to the point where it made sense to expose that to the outside world. And when we did that, we had to start rethinking the way the UI was done. There was a lot more sort of thought that needed to go into it, but we did have the appetite for people to use it, but we needed to respond to how they wanted to use it. So that, just start to change things. But I think it was opportunistic, but in a good way, right? We knew that it worked to build stuff. It just, the UX needed to change, and that's, we would only learn by productizing it and allowing it to the outside world.
Yeah. I mean, just one last example on that, just because I remember it now. For many people may know of the Museum of Other Realities, which is a VR museum of a lot of tilt brush, but also some other types of immersive art pieces, but in a proper VR museum. And the story on that, because I don't know what they're doing now, but they were very well positioned to be very popular in the COVID, pandemic lockdown time. But what the story was is that they were a studio making games, different types of, I guess, multi-user games, or not even multi-user games, but just they wanted to be able to test it as a team, a remote team. So they had a platform by which they could go as a team into each of the games that they were developing. And they ultimately said they found out that that tool, which was to help them to, test and give design feedback and iterate, the platform itself became something that they spent a fair bit of time in, enough time that they realized there's a value in just the platform itself, regardless of the games that they were developing. And that's what then became I guess, the functional foundation for the Museum of Other Realities, and probably some other things that they've made out of that platform. But that was the story of it. It was just, and I've heard the same thing. HTC told me that's what was the origin of I cannot remember what their collaborative meeting platform is right now. It's escaped me, but HTC said similarly they had developed a tool for internal use, and then it completely became itself a product. But as you mentioned, you have to service that now. That's a product now that has stakeholders that are not just internal, and that can be, I definitely have seen times where that didn't work out. The commitment wasn't there to further develop that and respond.
Yeah, so another thing at Erasmus, like I myself and my team use the tool that we'd exposed to customers ourselves to build experiences, and what we did to develop the product didn't serve us, which was to our frustration. But we weren't ultimately the people that were buying this, right? So we were selling to people that cared about different things than we did. So there's also that trade-off that you make.
Yeah. Okay. I just want, so we have one question from William to repeat the name of the company. It was the Museum of Other Realities. So they were California based. I think they're still around. Con XR and some other festivals hosted their exhibitions during the COVID time in there. So it's very worth checking out if it's still up on Steam. Yep.
One thought I had there is, you're asking about games as a product. Well, a game is a product if you're basing it, like, what are you measuring, I guess? So thinking about return users, how do you influence users to return? A lot of that will be about how you evolve that game. Maybe over time, it might be a case of adding new levels, but this will be still what requires a kind of product thinking hat on. You still have to think about those users and what it is that they need, because otherwise you won't be able to then grow your user base, maybe, or retain the user base that you've got. I think it all depends on what it is that you're measuring to determine how that game evolves.
Yeah, we'll move on, then we'll come back to some more. Feel free to keep sending your questions from the audience, and we will get to them.
Cool. So this one's just adaptive scope. As I said before, when you're building a client service projects, you're tending to have agreed that scope up front. And if they want to change the scope, then that requires a new statement of work, or you charge extra money for it. That's exactly how it would have worked at Aurasma. Whereas you need to move towards an adaptive scope. You need to change, pivot, be willing to pivot when you're getting information that tells you maybe you're headed in the wrong direction. And I think this is massively important, being able to adapt to feedback rather than keeping on the course that you're on just because that's what you started with. So this is, kind of the agile style thing, but just something that really requires a shift in mindset at that point. So to sort of summarize the 5 that I'm talking about here, you want to maintain a long-term vision, you want to establish and measure KPIs, you want to seek continuous feedback, you want to assign dedicated ownership to a team of people, and you want to adapt the scope as you learn. So that's kind of how I would suggest thinking about shifting the process. Conscious of time, in doing some research for this talk, I spoke with 5 different companies who kind of gave me a quote about their shift towards thinking about product. First one's George from Unfold VR. I really like this. So Unfold VR is an application. You can kind of see it in the background there, where you can make 3D models using geometric shapes. And there's lots of like different social games that you can do in there, like do charades, which is quite cool. But what George also has a services agency called CG Artifacts, and they've obviously moved from doing client work to building a product. And I thought they've echoed a lot, or George has echoed a lot of what I've said, but it's about aligning your funding to your core vision, and then also kind of using like your ability to move fast from building projects, so keeping your agility and your speed, but basically making sure that you're doubling down on your product vision, because when it comes to projects, your vision comes from your client. Ultimately, every single thing that you're building, it's what's the client vision, and then you serve that vision. And I thought that was a really interesting way of thinking about it. So that was from George. Leopoly, company out of Hungary, they have 3 different products, and I think they've kind of done exactly what we've been speaking about today. So they've moved from services to having a platform, but they sort of started both sequentially. So they built this platform or SDK, I can't remember which they would call it, but it's allowed them to then streamline their own building of client projects by 30 to 40%, because they can build scalable and reusable solutions. And then it's also meant that when they've got customers building their own projects using the platform, there's less reliance on Leopoly's sort of service providing outside of that, which I think is really important, right? If you're moving away from services to product, you need, especially if you've moved towards a platform as your product, you need to make sure that that platform doesn't require your services to help your client to be able to use it. And it's really interesting that's been Leopoly's approach there. Miva is a VR application to help teens that are neurodiverse. So it's about teaching them social cues, and there's a lot of a personalized approach to it. It's a really good, really cool idea. This one is about, as Elayo said, they had to move from doing research to being user-centric, which I think is an interesting one, because his point about research focusing on the technology rather than the user experience is definitely something that we suffered from at Ultraleap. And so now they've focused on more the outcomes. So exactly what I've been saying, they're looking at building more intuitive and empowering experiences for those users. And it's about what do they they expect the outcomes for those users to be, whether that's behavioral change. They've really shifted that, and I thought that was a great one as well. Rolf from Realm, this was one where they started as a services agency and built a project which they went and validated with their customers, who said, yeah, this looks like a multi-user platform that we would use. And so as a result, they were able to start selling what is now a product that they built directly with this user feedback. And this has meant that they're empowering their own customers to build their own sort of multi-user collaborative environments, and it's allowed them to scale. So this is a massive one to think about when you're talking about moving to a platform. It's all about that scalability. Last one from Vray. It's a company here in Ireland. I live in Ireland, by the way. So this one I liked because they were in services, but they were originally building lots of different use cases, and they've now very much focused on sort of hazardous training. But it's not just for XR, which I point out, but I think that's what they did, to move from, hey, we'll just build projects, to actually focusing on that as their core use case. And that really allowed them to scale. So they started providing a platform based on that, because they understood hazardous training as a use case. They then basically have spent a lot of time working on the data that shows the impact of using VR and digital transformation for doing training. So that has been ultimately the thing that's influenced the decision makers that they're selling to, has all been about the data that they're able to share and explain to validate the use cases for VR. So yeah, those are 5 examples that hopefully echo exactly what I've been saying.
I mean, what comes to mind just from these 5 is I'm thinking about the relationship to the client. I mean, it was something that alluded to, because the client determining a lot of things in a project. But I think maybe what we could discuss a little bit further with the last few minutes that we have is that at some point, the client is the all-important, the most important entity in the project. But in the product, there should be many clients. And thus, no one client is really your boss per se. Collectively, they are. But being able to say no to a client that this is not our use case, or this is not what we want to do with the product. And even if you pay us, can you pay us enough to overcome the fact that this is not in our roadmap? This is not what we have. This is not what other clients are wanting to pay for. I think that's interesting, just because I was reminded by some of the cases here that you presented, that there's an independence and there's a freedom from the demands of a particular client, of course, along with the risk that ultimately you need to get all of that in a smaller amount from many more clients.
Yeah, I think that's where what you'll find is companies building a product whilst doing services at the same time, and eventually kind of weaning off the services. So the services might be, we'll do this specific change within the product for this much extra money, but ultimately what you want to do is move away from that to prioritizing things. I think the way that I always talk about myself as a product person is that my job is to create the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. I'm utilitarian in that sense. Like, it's not about making you happy, client. It's about, well, what is it that we're trying to do in general? I think then it's also, you've really got to dig in with, some clients might come to you with a specific, we want to do this, but actually what they're implying they want to do isn't the right thing to do. What you got to do is dig into the problem that they're having. And then actually what you might find is that other people share that problem. And so you can deal with it in a different way. And it's a case of, again, validating the problem that they're trying to solve, rather than just building what you're being told that they want, because that also doesn't solve for more than one problem. It might also be what they end up wanting. You might deliver it and they're like, oh, actually, yeah, this wasn't what we wanted, and then you've wasted a lot of time. So I think it's dig into that problem to really understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it highlights that the relationship is different. It's a more of a partnership, but a project we have project partners, but there's a hierarchy to project partners. Whereas in this product scenario, there's a lot more about consent and willingness on both sides to take actions, and so again, they have to be willing to share with you perhaps, what their thought process was, and so engage in that time rather than just giving you the brief, but really working with you to understand what it is that their ultimate objective might be underneath it all.
Yeah, I think this is something we didn't do actually, but I've always wanted to try it. It's like when you in B2B, it's quite difficult to get the data out of the customer for what the success of what they've built is. So if they're using your platform and they've built an end user experience, well, are they sharing that data with you? Is that something that you can access? Because that would really help tell your story. So being able to have really good relationships with your customers is certainly in a B2B sense is really important. And it kind of needs to be that regular sort of touch point so that you're making sure to learn the way that they are using what you've built and how to anticipate maybe things that are going to be coming up in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. That's kind of it, really. My last slide is self-promotion. But yeah, so my name's Chris Burgess, and you can find me. I've got my website here and LinkedIn. I've got a QR code here which links to a survey. If you are looking to shift from projects to building a product, or even if you're just already building a product and you want help to do that better, then let's talk. If you scan the QR code there, you can go through the survey and then choose how you want me to contact you. But that'd be really good. I'll come back to you within 24 hours and just kind of tell you what I think we should do. But please do that. It'd be great to hear from people on the session today. And otherwise, thanks for having me today, Michael.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for this big drop of experience and knowledge. And I think just judging by the questions from the audience, it was, it resonated, it connected, and I'm keen for this to find a wider audience over the next several weeks and months as we share this. So definitely encourage anyone to reach out to Chris, and I wish you success if you are considering going down the product development line. There are challenges, but there are rewards, and definitely Europe needs to have more products, more product thinking coming out of this. So I hope, Chris, that you do get some good meetings out of this from some of our audience. So thank you very much again. Thank you for everyone who watched and stayed with us as we went long, but that's usually a good sign. We had a lot to talk about, and keep checking our LinkedIn page for our upcoming meetings. We'll do more deep dive discussions. We'll do some industry research presentations coming up, and feel free to reach out if you want to learn more about XR for Europe as well, and how we help different communities and clusters and hubs, research institutions, SMEs and companies to better work with XR in Europe. So thank you very much, everyone. I'll go ahead and take off the screen sharing so you can see our faces up close a little bit more, and see you next time. So thanks again, Chris, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.